If you've spent any amount of time vibe coding, you have almost definitely seen some React code generated by whatever AI tool you were using. But you may or may not have understood what was actually happening in that React code, or why almost every AI tool seems to use it, or why developers use it, or anything like that. My golden rule of vibe coding is that you should always understand the code that's being generated by your AI tool. And so in this tutorial, we're going to quickly go over the fundamentals of React so that next time you vibe code your way to a new UI, you actually understand what your AI is doing, which will help you be better able to make edits, add to it, make adjustments, prompt the AI in the right direction, all that kind of stuff. So what we're looking at right here is vanilla JavaScript. JavaScript is the language of the web. Any interactivity on any website you've been on is going to be handled by JavaScript. React is a JavaScript library that makes it easier to build and work with UIs. But what we're doing right now is we're looking at what is a super simple to-do list application where the interactivity is managed by JavaScript. So if we go look at this application, we can see a super basic interface where I can say new thing, add, it'll append it to a list here. I can remove things, add some more, and all of this interactivity is being managed by this JavaScript that we have here in our code. So we can look at our HTML here, which is very simple. We've got a form, and then we've got an empty list down here. And so what's going to happen is whenever we submit this form by hitting enter or hitting the add button, is we are going to create a new to-do item using this JavaScript function right here. And what's actually happening here is that we're going to be creating this new list item element. We're going to set the content of it to whatever is passed in here. And then we're going to create the remove button, and then we're going to add an event listener so that when we click that remove button, the new list item gets removed. So when I run this, everything we just said is what's happening under the hood. And our JavaScript code here, you can see what's kind of happening here is it's telling it exactly what we need to do step by step, one thing at a time. So we're giving instructions, step-by-step instructions for how we want the UI to change based on the action that we've taken. Down here, what we're doing is we're adding an event listener for that submit form, and this is what's actually going to make it so that whenever we submit the form, this function that we just went through is what actually gets executed. So, same thing here, we've got our to-do text, and then if it's not empty, then that's what we're going to do here is we're going to create the new to-do item, append it, and so this is what's actually setting up the listener so that when we submit that form, this is what's actually going to be happening. So this is all using what we would call vanilla JavaScript. But the more important concept I want you to understand today is that this is using what's called imperative programming. And imperative programming is where we are instructing our application exactly what we want it to do step by step. So in this case, what we are doing is we are writing within our JavaScript program, we are describing exactly what we want to happen to the UI in a step-by-step manner every time we do a certain action. And that's fine, there's nothing technically wrong with it, but the problem is that this is pretty easy to wrap your head around with this super basic application. But the more complex our application gets, the more functionality we add to it, the harder it becomes to maintain something like this, where we are describing exactly what's happening step by step. And the reason is because we end up having more side effects where we do one thing and something else over here is affected. But if we don't explicitly program that into our code or handle it in our code, it's going to cause random edge cases and random errors and random things that we don't want to happen. And it just becomes over time this spaghetti code and monstrosity, and it's very, very difficult to maintain. So instead, what React did when it came along is it sort of changed the paradigm for creating new UIs, where instead of describing exactly what we want to happen on every single action, which is the imperative model, we're using what's called a declarative model, where all we're doing is we are describing to AI what we want the end state of our UI to look like, and we are letting it handle all of the logistics and the functionality of that under the hood. So imperative versus declarative. An analogy I sometimes like to use is imperative programming is more like me giving you step-by-step directions to get somewhere, whereas declarative programming is me just telling you where we're going and then you plugging it into Google Maps and having everything done for you as far as the navigation goes for how to get there. That's kind of the difference between imperative and declarative programming. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this imperative JavaScript code and we're going to convert it to React so that you can kind of see some of these advantages and see the differences between something like this and something like React. And remember, the entire goal here is not for you to memorize all of this syntax so that you can type it out manually like an old school developer would do, What we're doing instead is we're trying to turn you into a competent, efficient vibe coder where you have enough knowledge and enough high-level information about what is actually happening that you can better understand what the AI is doing and then better prompt it and direct it in the future. That's what being a good vibe coder is all about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here. I'm in agent mode and cursor, and I'm just going to say, convert this into a simple React app. I'm going to say keep it simple for demo purposes and add comments highlighting the advantages of using React, including things like declarative programming components, props, and state. And these are a couple of the core building blocks that make up React that we'll go over in a little bit. And add one more thing here. And I'm going to say use a CDN so we can keep it as a single HTML file and avoid creating a full-blown React app and build system. We want to keep it as simple as possible. The reason I want to add this is because usually what will happen is if we just ask it to do this on its own, it's going to create a whole React application for us with the build system and everything, which is best practice. That's what we would do if we were building a real project, but it just adds complexities for a demo that we don't need to deal with right now. So we're going to hit enter. All right, so after working through a few quirks with the AI, we got the index.html file updated. So we are going to go ahead and walk through that. I'm actually going to get rid of our AI pane to give us a little bit more room. Right here, we're just adding some styling. That's not the focus of this video, so we don't need to worry about that. Down here where the script tag starts is where we want to start. So we're just pulling in React from a CDN, Content Distribution Network. This is basically just allowing us to use React without having to install it directly in our system and set up the whole build process and everything. This is not something you would do for a production application, but it's great for demos. One thing I want to point out is that our HTML is actually empty. It's just an empty div with an ID of root, and then we jump into JavaScript. And that's because we're actually going to be utilizing React to handle all of our HTML construction. Really, the core idea behind React is that your UI is just a function of your data. And so React is allowing us to take all of our data, run it through some functions, and it is going to then use that to construct our UI under the hood. And so we're going to look at how we actually do that and what the differences are between this and between what we were just looking at a second ago. So the first thing we have here is we have a function called toDoItem. And this is actually what's called a functional component. And so one of the core concepts of React is that it uses reusable components in order to construct our UI. And the reason for that is that anytime we have a toDoItem, we are just going to be rendering this functional component, which means we can just edit it one time, anytime we need to edit anything. And so we get to then just take these components, use them anywhere without having to go and manually update a bunch of different pieces of our code. And the other thing that we're doing here is we're passing in what are called props. So the text and the onRemove function are going to be passed in as props. And we can see right here, we've got the text here. These curly brackets indicate that this is dynamic content dictated by this prop. And so this is going to represent a list item with the text of whatever we pass into it. And whatever we pass into here is what's going to happen when we click this remove button. And so this syntax is a little bit weird. This is called JSX, if you're not familiar with it. This is basically React flavored HTML. And so what we're actually doing here is we're writing a version of HTML, but we're writing it within the return statement of a JavaScript function. So what we're technically doing here is we are returning JavaScript, and what's going to happen is React behind the scenes is going to compile this syntax down into a set of functions to do exactly what we saw in the previous version of this, where it's going to manually append these things to the DOM. But now, rather than us having to do those things, it's abstracted away to React, and we can just construct our UI how we normally would in something like HTML, but with the dynamic ability of React and JavaScript added in. So that's what this first function is doing. The second function is going to be our main app component. This is kind of the same thing. So if we go down here at create root, what this is doing is this is taking that app component that we have right here, and it is appending it to the root element. This is not something that you would normally have to do if you're using something like a Next.js as a framework or anything, but this is what's actually happening under the hood when you do React stuff, is it's taking the components that you construct, appending them directly to the HTML, handling all the complexity under the hood. So with our main app component, we've got a couple different things here. First, we have what is called state, and state is how we manage the state of our user interface. So we're setting up state here where we have a set of to-dos, and then we're creating a new function here called set to-dos, which is how we actually update it, and we're setting the initial state to an empty array. So this is just setting a new state object of that will actually hold our to-dos list. An array is just a list of items, and it's just setting it to be empty right now. And this is how we actually manage the current state of our input. So if we look back at our form, this to-dos item is going to correspond to all of these items. So each one of these is a to-do item component that we created right here. And collectively, this data is being rendered from this array of to-dos. So React is taking this data, this array of to-dos, and it is passing it through to this component function in order to render each of our to-do items. And this state variable right here that is set to input, that corresponds to this, the thing that I'm actually typing into this text box. I have to manage that and keep track of that using React, and so that's what that state variable corresponds to. So we're creating a function here called handle submit. This is very similar to what we looked at in the last video, except in this version of the submit handler, what we are doing instead is actually manipulating our data, and we're letting React update the UI for us. So we can see that right here. Declarative, we update the state and React updates the UI for us. So what we're doing here is rather than directly manipulating the UI, what we're doing is we're actually just manipulating this set of data. So we're just saying our to-dos item, we're going to add a new item to that, and then we're going to clear the input. And when we do that, React is automatically going to detect under the hood that that state changed, and it's going to update our UI for us. We don't have to do that manually. Handle remove, very similar. All we're doing is updating our data. And again, remember the core idea behind React is that our UI is just a function of our data. And so we're updating our data, we're letting React handle the UI updates for us. This is going to make our application much more manageable, much easier and more enjoyable to work with, especially as the complexity grows. And this is the kind of stuff that you're going to see as the building blocks for most UIs that you build with AI tools. They're going to be built on top of React in most cases, unless you explicitly say otherwise. They're going to be built on React, and so understanding the fundamentals of how it works, you're going to be able to much easier go in and understand what your AI is actually building. So the last step here is we're actually just going to return the actual structure of what we want this application to look like. So this whole part is pretty similar to what we saw before, except we've got some of our dynamic data built in instead of hard coding it. So we're setting the value to be consistent with our input state management here. That's how we keep track of what is currently in the form. Then we have an onChange handler here, which is going to set the input to that value. So basically, this is going to get run every time we type into that text box, and it's going to update the value there. And then we've got a submit button add. We have a handle submit button here, so that whenever we submit this form, it's going to call that, very similar to how we did before, except that handle submit is going to run this, which again is just going to update our data and let UI manage the UI update, or let React manage the UI update for us. And here is the last part we'll cover today is this part right here. So we have our unordered list, and remember before with the HTML, all we had by default was just an empty unordered list. We're manually appending LIs to it every time we hit that function. What we're doing here instead is, again, we take this idea of our UI being a function of our data, and what we're doing is we're taking that data structure, so this list of to-dos, and we are mapping through them, which means we are iterating through each one. And for each one of those, we are assigning two new variables, the to-do itself and an index. Index just meaning what order it is in the list. So index is start at 0 in JavaScript. So the first item in the list would be index 0. The reason we need this is because when we manage lists of items using React, we need to pass each one a key so that React can effectively keep track of which one is which, so that when we do something like remove one, it's not accidentally removing a different one than we intended. So that's what the key is for. And then the text corresponds to the actual text of the to-do item itself that is stored in this data right here. So that's what's going to be passed into the component. And if you see right here, What we're doing here is we're iterating through the data of the to-dos, and for each one we are rendering an instance of this to-do item component, passing that data in as props so we know exactly what to render in these dynamic sections right here. So for each one of the to-do items in the data array, we're going to render a new to-do item component, passing it this specific data, and then it will be able to effectively render what we need it to here. And we've got our new handlers for removing and everything. So that is sort of a high-level whirlwind tour of the fundamentals of React for vibe coders. With this foundational knowledge, you can now go out and when you're actually generating this code using a UI tool, you will have a much better idea what's actually happening under the hood. And now you can go through and review the code that your AI tool is generating, understand what it's actually doing, which is going to make it much easier for you to actually just update it in the future and be able to more effectively work with your AI tools as a vibe coder. So with all that said, hope you like this. By the way, if you're interested in more of like a structured learning approach to learning this kind of stuff, I do have a group called Vibe Coders. The link's in the description. I'm working on the flagship course now, which is called the 30-Day AI Coding Challenge. That's going to walk you through from start to finish over the course of 30 days. You're going to build your own application from scratch in a way that's production ready, well tested, and you're actually going to understand the fundamentals of what all the code is doing along the way, which is going to make you a significantly more effective vibe coder so you can actually build things that are useful, robust, well tested, and that you could actually deploy out to users. So that's kind of the goal of both the group Vibe Coders and our initial flagship course. Huge, massive discount right now because I'm still working on the first course. So as a thank you for being an early adopter, you get a huge discount. So links in the description if you want to check that out. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.